A KXAN analysis of school finance records found the majority of school districts here in Central Texas are facing budget shortfalls, many in the millions. This week on Inside the Investigations, KXAN investigator Kelly Wiley discusses the financial situation, forcing districts to make devastating budget cuts. Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on KXAN Live. I'm Will Dupree, coming to you from the KXAN Live studio. We appreciate you being here for yet another edition of Inside the Investigations. This is a weekly deep dive into one of the stories that our incredible investigative team here at KXAN has uncovered. And joining me is my co-host, investigative reporter, Kelly Wiley. Kelly, thank you for being here, and happy Friday to you.
Happy Friday!
We've made it.
Barely.
I know. We are hanging on, but we are very glad to have this conversation because we're focusing on a story that you did this most recently with a few members of our team here, really looking at kind of the back-to-school season and the situation that a lot of districts are facing. I just want to give credit where credit is due, though. You and our education reporter, Nabil Ramadna, and our digital data reporter, Christopher Adams, have spent a lot of time trying to understand what many advocates and lawmakers have called a school budget crisis here in Texas. What did you find?
Well, I think to better understand it, and you know better than anyone doing so many reports in the legislature, you kind of have to go back a little bit. We all remember, I'm sure, when Governor Greg Abbott convened a teacher vacancy task force, and this was in reaction to some really staggering numbers of teachers, not just leaving a school or a school district, but leaving the profession altogether. And so the governor convened this task force of educators, superintendents, stakeholders to figure out what were the root causes for teachers leaving. And I mean, there were a lot of things that they found. They found, feeling overworked, feeling like they didn't have the proper resources. But you can imagine pay was pretty high up on that list. And so they released this report, and going into the last regular session, lawmakers were armed with this information. They knew that they needed to act on increasing teacher pay for sure, but also as a part of that, bolstering up public school funding. And yet, we've reported on this so many times, we know that in the regular session, in the 4 special sessions afterwards, significant public school funding increases, we should say, just didn't come to fruition. The amount of public school funding came up for sure, but not in a way that districts were actually able to increase their purchasing power or give those raises or be in a better financial situation. So that's kind of how we got here today.
Yeah, and I think that if we just want to give a little even more context, so much of what happened last year during that long succession of legislative sessions was that, there was so much debate over school vouchers, or at least that's what critics are calling them. The governor has pushed for education savings accounts, these private school subsidy plans. That really held up. The opposition to that held up a lot of support for raising school funding, too. So that is another rabbit hole we could get into at another time. But I just want to point out again, Kelly, that let's just remind people when the last time was the state increased public school funding here in Texas.
Sure. And to understand that, I think we need to understand public school funding is so complicated anywhere, but especially in Texas. School funding can come from a lot of different sources, but what's important to understand at its base, the probably biggest funding driver that comes from the state for public school districts is the basic allotment. And that's the base amount of funding that the state provides per student. And the last time we saw that increased at all was 2019. So let's think about what's happened since 2019, the pandemic and inflation. And if you're really immersed in school districts, you know that enrollment and attendance are also things that school districts have been struggling with, and that feeds into the funding formula as well. So a lot has happened, and school districts have said they need to see at least a $1,000 increase to the basic allotment just to restore the purchasing power they had in 2019.
So in your reporting that you and several other members here at KXAN looked into, we're seeing that, districts are facing a pretty precarious situation when it comes to their own funding. How is this all impacting them?
Well, that's where our data brains kind of came in. We reached out to every school district in Central Texas and we asked them three questions. We wanted to know how much they were paying in recapture, which is essentially how much the state will claw back from property taxes for certain districts and then redistribute to other less property rich districts. So we wanted to know that. We wanted to know how much their expenditures were for that year for their adopted budget. And then we wanted to know the deficit, which is essentially how much, if they're spending more than they're bringing in. And we found, we just finalized this data because some school districts are on a September, August budget cycle, some are establishing their budgets earlier, but we found at least 65% of school districts in Central Texas are in a deficit, and it ranges. Some school districts are $62,000 in the red. Some school districts are $119 million in the red, and that's Austin ISD, which is the largest school district in our area. So it's not really a big surprise that they would have the biggest deficit in our area. And the rest are mostly having balanced budgets. But even when you talk to those school districts, they'll say, like, we are just barely there, and it meant us having to make decisions around maybe not giving as big a raises to teachers. And maybe it meant that we had to strategically cut programs that we really value. And then we just did a story on a school district, Round Top Carmine, where they were actually able to adopt a budget with a surplus. It was like $150,000 surplus, but their superintendent told us, like, we might not make it through the rest of the school year with that surplus. They have $150,000 in AC repairs they need to make, and they do not have it in their budget right now. So that's what it looks like in our area, and that mirrors what it looks like in other parts of Texas too. These deficits are across the board, across the state. And like we were just telling you, even in school districts where they were able to get a balanced budget, they'll be quick to point out that the different sacrifices they had to make in order to do that.
Yeah, so maybe not too much cause for celebration, at least for a long period of time. But one thing that we keep hearing from school district leaders pretty much all across the state is that they want state lawmakers to be able to raise and increase public school funding. So what are districts planning to do as we're heading into another legislative session in January, and we don't know for sure what will come from that at this point?
Right. I mean, we held a roundtable with 3 school district superintendents. Round Rock ISD's superintendent, Matias Segura from Austin ISD, and Dr. Wright from Hayes, which are some of the bigger school districts in our area. And they were, I think, this was some of the most really expansive direct commentary I'd heard from them about what this means for their school districts. And one person who stuck out to me was Superintendent Segura, who said flat out, like, he's trying to insulate the district and make decisions that can put them in a better spot with this deficit, regardless of what the legislature does. And he said, during our interview, he said he wants to do that because they've shown that they are willing to do nothing. And that's what we saw last session as far as making significant public school funding increases. And so one thing that Austin ISD is doing, they're going to voters in November asking for a tax rate increase. And they would be able to cut their deficit with Vader with the voter approved tax rate increase to $78 million. So their deficit would sit at $78 million. But then on top of that, they would have to make a lot of cuts. You're seeing right now kind of a list of the different cuts that they said they could potentially make to also get their deficit down. And I mean, it's cuts that are pretty concerning to their school board and then to other community leaders, teachers. They're talking about taking away busing to certain campuses, not their legally required busing, but think like magnet school type busing. They're talking about reducing stipends that they offer to some of the most hard to staff positions, like these multilingual educators and special education educators. So really devastating cuts that they'll have to look at. Again, they've not approved any of these cuts at this point, but those are things that they discussed that could be potential areas to look at. And then you'll see a district like Round Rock ISD. They were able to pass a balanced budget, but they're also asking for a really big bond package in the next election too, to make repairs to their school district. And we heard the superintendent tell us he kind of has a different view as far as insulating the school district, regardless of the legislature's decisions. He really feels that even with the tools that they have at their disposal right now, the state has to increase the basic allotment or they're going to remain in this precarious situation.
And back to that district that has been able to operate, at least with a surplus temporarily, Round Top Carmine, what did they say about talking about how they're moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, again, to remind you guys of what he said, we've been able to get this surplus, $150,000, but we do not know if we're going to make it to the end of the year with that. They need to make $150,000 worth of AC repairs. And he actually said, this was really striking to me, if we were fully staffed, we would be in a deficit. He said we have 2 vacancies, and if we were able to hire for them, which we want to, we would be in the same situation as a lot of districts in our area. So they also are going to voters in November asking for a tax rate increase. The tax rate increase they're asking for is a little bit different. It's what the state calls golden pennies. And this would basically mean if the tax rate was approved by voters, they would be able to keep 100% of the revenue from that tax rate increase. It differs a little bit from the tax rate increase that other school districts in our area are asking for in that way.
So in your reporting, we've mentioned, we're talking to school district leaders about their plans and how they're handling this situation too. But the other side of this is what's happening at the state capitol. What are state lawmakers telling you at this point when you checked in with them?
For this report, we talked to Senator Brandon Creighton, who he authored a bill, multiple bills that would have increased public school funding and also that would have created an education savings account program. We also talked to Representative Gina Hinojosa, who sits on the Public Education Committee and is from the Austin area. Her kids go to Austin ISD. And they both want to increase public school funding. That's what they're telling us. They both see it as a priority going into the next regular session. The real rub here is how that fits in with education savings accounts. We saw in the last, in the regular session, these were kind of brought up as separate issues. But as we saw in I think it was some of the special sessions, we saw the issues become combined. And that's where we saw kind of the stalemate. When education savings account, the proposal for that and the proposal to increase public school funding was combined, that's where we saw both of them fail again. And so the real rub is, and what we're trying to understand is whether or not they're going to be combined again in the next regular session. Are they, can they be passed together? Can they be passed separately? Or will they, them being combined keep either from passing? And when we asked Senator Creighton whether or not he plans to bring these issues together again in a bill, he said he didn't know. He said there was new senators, new representatives that have come in, and he's still asking them, what their thoughts on are for the way forward. But he's not necessarily opposed to doing that. And then you talk to Representative Hinojosa, and they're very focused on eliminating or not letting education savings accounts pass. They think in the end it'll lead to there being a funding issue anyway, just if education savings accounts are passed. And they're also focused on making sure public school funding happens. So we kind of have left off in the same place. And based on these interviews, it seems we're in the same place. So we'll have to see how it plays out, but I would expect for both of them to be on the table again. There's kind of a question mark.
Yeah, this could be the dominant issue when the next legislative session starts on January 14th next year. And we should just also point out in the political context, the November election is still hanging out there as well. And Governor Abbott has pushed out a lot of these Republican incumbents in the Texas House who stood in the way and opposed any kind of private school subsidies. On the flip side, the Democrats have told me in some of my own reporting that they believe this issue could actually help them flip some seats in the Texas House of Representatives so that they can still stand against any kind of money that might be siphoned off from public schools. So it's an incredibly interesting calculus that's going to play out in the election. What those results will be, we will just have to wait and see. Of course, Kelly, you'll be following along what happens in the next legislative session as well as many of us here at the KXAN News team. So the story does not end with this live stream.
Not at all. I think we're going to be updating a lot of this reporting. I think the biggest takeaway is that the longer this goes on, the more precarious the situation gets for school districts. And I think the main takeaway that I had from the roundtable with the superintendents, from these conversations with school leaders and from parents and teachers, is that the longer this goes, the closer the cuts get to the classroom, right? A lot of the cuts that the districts have been trying to make are to central office, which still touches the classroom in some ways, but they're trying to stave it off. But the longer it goes, the closer the cuts get to programming, staffing that directly touches our classroom that students are in. So it's definitely a situation to watch.
All right. Well, that is KXAN investigative reporter Kelly Wiley. Thank you so much, Kelly, for your reporting about this, which has been going on for years at this point, and I know it will only continue. But remind people where they can find this special report on our website.
Yeah, you can go to KXAN.com under the Investigates tab, and it's Texas in the Red. It's a 2-part series. We just actually added a 3rd part. So I would suggest watching the whole thing.
Yeah, I think so too. Again, everybody, you can go to KXAN.com for that latest information. That is Kelly Wiley. I'm Will Dupree. We will see you back here at another time with other updates. Hope you all enjoy your Friday and the weekend. Take care.